Well, Abby Phillip, CNN anchor, she's the host of CNN Newsnight with Abby Phillip, made an admission on Breakfast Club in a conversation with Charlemagne the God and crew that is worth pausing on for sure. I'm going to get to it in just a moment. We have the video, but first make sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe on YouTube and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Now let's take a look at this clip of Abby Phillip on Breakfast Club Tuesday, getting pushed on the ideological bias of CNN.
We're not Fox News, but we're also not MSNBC. That's true. We're probably center left, and I think that has a lot to do with our audience.
So I've long said that you could basically fix trust in media overnight by having these networks and papers come out and just admitting they're biased. And just say, hey, we're coming from the center left, or hey, we're coming from the far left, or anything like that, right? Like the types of editorial endorsements that the New York Times does. Just say that that also applies to the news side, because I think what drives media distrust right now is people feel like they are being lied to. And Gallup just had its annual mass media, trust in mass media poll come out this month. It comes out every October, and they've been measuring this since the mid-70s. We're at a record low. A record low. After Donald Trump enters politics, it dips, goes back up a little bit, and now 10 years later, it's actually at a record low. It was tied for a record low 2 years before now. It actually went further down. So, what does that tell you? I would be concerned if trust in media were high right now, because the media is not improving. But is Abby Phillip's little admission here on Breakfast Club a sign of improvement? No. She was asked that she was asked over and over again about this question, and I think with great hesitation, let's just put it that way, with great hesitation was pulled kicking and screaming into saying, well, we're probably center left, but we're not MSNBC. And it's true, right? MSNBC is basically open that their primetime lineup, they're the inverse of Fox, right? Fox is like, we're doing news during the day. MSNBC claims to be doing news during the day. I'd argue both of their news coverage is Fox center right, MSNBC center left, and then they say our opinion hours, our primetime hours, those are left. Those are openly ideologically left. It's Chris Hayes, for example, or Rachel Maddow. These are liberal opinion hosts, and Fox News does the same thing with Laura Ingraham, Sean Hannity, etc. But the problem is CNN and Abby Phillip. She's called an anchor. She purports to be somebody who's basically like right down the middle, and says things. I mean, I'm glad that she admitted the network is center left. I'd be curious how Abby Phillip would defend her own coverage, because actually, the Media Research Center did a study. This is a conservative group. They did a study back in September, and they counted how many times they took a random sample of 10 episodes of CNN Newsnight, and they counted how many times Abby Phillip just interrupted different guests from whether it's left or the right. They found she interrupted her liberal guests 3 times and her conservative guests 127 times. So basically, they said conservatives were interrupted 60% of the time and were interrupted adversarially 58% of the time. Liberals were interrupted only 8% of the time and were interrupted adversarially just 1% of the time. Of the 30 guests who were never interrupted adversarially, 29 were liberals. The sole conservative to avoid being cut off by Phillip spoke only twice for a total of 68 seconds. A lot of this comes from Scott Jennings and is, of course, difficult to quantify. But Abby Phillip also has, a record here. At one point, this was in August, she said that she hears that Biden weaponized the government against their opponents, and then, quote, but there has yet to date been no proof that any of that was directed by the president of the United States. If I'm wrong, where is the proof? Because I've yet to see any proof of Joe Biden directing that. She also said this idea that this was weaponized, these were all different prosecutions in all these different jurisdictions, were not directed from one place. There's absolutely no evidence of that. You guys can tell me what evidence you have of that, but I've never seen it, and I've never heard anybody actually voice it. This is, at best, the most charitable explanation of this is Abby Phillip arguing openly that it's a matter of fact that there wasn't a directed lawfare campaign against Donald Trump. What is the evidence? They're all Democrats. Like, first of all, everyone who was doing lawfare against Donald Trump, from Fani Willis to Letitia James to Biden appointees, were coming from the left. So there's your evidence. But if you want to go even further, there's the evidence that we covered here that Tulsi Gabbard laid out about evidence coming, and it is disputed, to be fair, but it is evidence. And Abby Phillip is saying, I don't see any evidence. It's a matter of fact there is no evidence. There's significant evidence that the weaponization was directed specifically, that the entire Russia collusion hoax was directed specifically by Obama. How about the fact that the CIA and the FBI organized 51 former intelligence officers. Part of that, according to Sean Davis in The Federalist, at least one person was using an active CIA email account in the government to say that media shouldn't be covering and voters shouldn't be taking seriously the Hunter Biden laptop because it had all of the hallmarks of Russian disinformation. These are just a couple of examples of Abby Phillip, but she is a good reflection of the type of liberal who believes that her facts are not disputed, right? That she believes conservative arguments to the set of facts legacy media considers to be consensus objectivity are their arguments are conspiracy theories, their arguments are baseless, but her, the responsible anchor, her facts aren't skewed to the left. Her facts are just objective. That is one of the most dangerous viewpoints that you can have in media, that you can have as a news anchor, because it ends up completely blowing up your trust. And so I hope Abby Phillip considers herself center left, and I hope she is honest about herself being center left. But I think even from her resistance to the label, her hesitance to the label the entire network center left, which the entire network obviously is center left. But the entire network should be honest about being center left. Their news coverage. I hear her when she says, I think people should watch our news coverage. And I do watch her news coverage. And that is the thing that gets thrown against Fox News all the time. And then when you watch their daytime programming, it's actually, it's not like it's being, it's not like the daytime news anchors are Sean Hannity. And the same is true of CNN and MSNBC. It's not like the daytime news anchors are Rachel Maddow, and it's not like the daytime news anchors are, ideological like leftists on CNN. That's certainly not the case. But obviously the news coverage is center left, and that shouldn't be something that Charlemagne the God has to pry out of you. That should be something that you are open with the audience about. It should be like blaring. You're open with the audience about it, that this is coming from one position, because that's just about trust. It doesn't necessarily need to change the way you do your reporting, although I would certainly, if I were in charge of CNN, God forbid, I would certainly change the way that they do a lot of the news coverage. But it's like with Biden's health, for example, to act like CNN and MSNBC. I mean, CNN's obviously trying to change their coverage now, but to act like they weren't completely involved in the Biden age cover up, to act like they weren't completely involved in going way further than most of the country on trans issues, to act like they weren't involved in playing up the allegations of Trump being an asset of Russia. These are all just last 10 years. They weigh heavily on people's minds. And to have that just be pried out of an anchor who's on a morning radio show, I think is a really good example about what the problem is at places like CNN. So Phillip, she was involved in cheap fakes too. Like, that's another, the cheap fake narrative about Joe Biden. This was her on June 17th of 2024. And I'm getting a lot of this from MRC, by the way, over at Newsbusters. You can see the clip. She says, the news a lot of Americans see. June 17th. Right in the middle of the cheap fake fervor, which was being spread by the White House, repeated as fact by people in media. The White House was saying these are right-wing conspiracy theories. They're cutting up videos selectively to make it look like Joe Biden is not, perfectly competent, etc. And yeah, of course, some videos were being cut in ways that distorted the truth. Of course, that's what partisan politics are. But it's not the job of the journalists to downplay the entire narrative, which was that Joe Biden was visibly at the Clooney fundraiser, at the Juneteenth celebration, looking incapacitated. She said on June 17th, the news a lot of Americans see and the manipulation that's distorting the 2024 election. The November choice is between two old men. We know that. But tonight I want to talk about the Joe Biden that Republicans want you to see and the pipeline of videos that aren't telling the full truth. Now, those videos are probably right now clogging the public consciousness and as Americans start to think about their votes. The RNC wants to weaponize questions around Biden's age. Yes, the RNC wants to weaponize questions around Biden's age because they are trying to get the votes of people who see Biden's age as a significant problem, which public polling was showing for a long time was a whole bunch of Americans and a whole bunch of Democrats. Perfect example. I mean, it's just like on a silver platter of going out of the way to take a shot at the right when the much bigger story is the cover-up that's happening with Biden's age. That CNN's Jake Tapper, who is obviously center-left, eventually reported out in a book with Alex Thompson. There was a campaign from people like Karine Jean-Pierre to silence this coverage. So this is all just to say the best thing these networks could do is not have one of their anchors go on a morning news show and just begrudgingly say, we're probably center-left. Shouldn't be like that. It should be, this is openly a center-left network. Our editorial slant is center-left. Tell that to your viewers. It's why independent media is flourishing right now, because the vast majority of people of independent media, whether they're never Trump Republicans like Tim Miller, whether they're conservatives, whether they are sort of like leftists, whatever it is, they're flourishing right now because people are desperate for honesty. And independent media can't have a Kiev bureau or a Jerusalem bureau for the most part. It's just not there yet. But those people who do have the money and the resources, they're part of massive corporations, to have those bureaus all over the world, to be doing war reporting, people will trust them more if they just if they're just straight up with viewers where they're coming from. That will make that reporting all the more powerful. And that's where I think the trust deficit is right now. You kind of have to rely on these massive networks for the reporting on the ground in those places. They're the ones that can send embeds around the country on campaigns, midterm season heating up. They should just be honest. Just be honest, because they're not going to be able to change the fact that Abby Phillip sees not everything, but sees a lot of the narratives that come out of the right as conspiracy mongering or partisan football, whereas she sees what comes out of the left as much more objective, or what comes out of the Democratic Party as much more objective. Like, that is just somebody with a clear as day ideological bias who can't see her own ideological bias. And so she should just admit that she's from the center left. And then people can say, oh, this is someone who's not able to discern what their own biases as they watch her coverage. The American people are smarter than most journalists. So that's the best way to fix this problem. My perspective, how do you get to a place where people who are anchors on CNN or reporters or editors at legacy media publications don't have this inability to see their own bias? Well, that's a class problem. You need to have people who are coming from different backgrounds, who aren't, just going into the newsroom because they check an identity box that is an immutable characteristic, but actually comes from a different background, comes from a different class background, didn't go to Harvard, didn't go to Princeton, didn't go to journalism school, but actually came from a different place, worked their way up through the local media, or, like, I say this as somebody who went to a nice East Coast school, and basically when I went into media was straight into an opinion position at a very young age, and never did local coverage, although I did have a local internship at the marketing department of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, fun fact. But the point is, there are so many people from one class background in the media, and the ideological bias is more downstream of that than anything else. I always say Charles Murray's Coming Apart is the best book about journalism that has nothing to do with journalism. It talks about elite sorting over the last 10 or so years in this country, or 10 or so, the last several decades or so in this country, that have pushed people in these positions of power to be alienated from people of different class backgrounds, and to be just disproportionately culturally ensconced in bubbles, based on socioeconomic sorting, so education and affluence. And that's a real problem. A lot of this is downstream of that, but the best quick fix, just say you're center left. Just say it. Just say what your background is, what you support. Do it. That's the best way to get trust with viewers. There are very few people who can actually do this type of coverage. I know a lot of journalists, and I would say like maybe 90% of them, seriously, there's a handful of people I know in journalism who genuinely come at this with an objective, neutral perspective. They really don't care, but they're such a minority. There's so few people who are able to reflect that perspective in their coverage. Like they're really doing objectively and neutrally. Most people can't. So most people should be honest about it. All right. Thanks so much for tuning into today's edition of Undercurrents. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, on YouTube and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. We'll see you back here soon with more.